Hi Year 10, it's Miss Payne again, here for Poetry Shot Session 6. This week we're going to be looking at Exposure by Wilfred Owen, an absolutely iconic poem that depicts the true horror of what life was like in the trenches of World War One. Exposure. Our brains ache in the merciless, iced east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles far off, like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army attacks once more in ranks of shivering ranks of grey, but nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. With sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause, and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires, glozed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed. On us all doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever sun smiles true on child or field or fruit, for God's invincible spring, our love is made afraid, therefore not loath, we lie out here, therefore were born, for love of God seems dying. Tonight, this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels in shaking grasp, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. A very chilling poem there, and I would suggest that this is a poem that you do spend a great deal of time on, Year 10. The reason for this is because there are so many of the other texts within the anthology that this one will lend itself to comparing with. So it's one to really get inside. It's a beautiful poem and it's rich with so much imagery that you can talk about. So I'm going to talk about the title again and thinking about the word exposure. When we've talked about this in class, it can mean a great deal of different things, some of them cheekier than others, of course. But realistically, in this poem, we're thinking about men's exposure to the horror of war, principally, but also exposure to weather. And that's something that we see coming across, making the men very much victims of this enemy too. Today I'm going to talk about context and what the poem is about pretty much together because the two things dovetail so beautifully. And so just to mention a little bit about Wilfred Owen, he was a poet soldier. So he was actually in the trenches. He was writing all of this stuff down. So he truly witnessed the full horror of the conditions on the front line, and dreadful they were. I'm sure you know from your studies in history with Miss Norton or Mr. Modica. Now, a number of his poems were published after the war. In fact, a great deal of World War I literature didn't really pass the censorship rules in this country until the 1960s. And so there is an argument, of course, that it was the scholars of English literature that rewrote our understanding of what the true conditions of World War I life was like, rather than the historians. We see that Owen was a type of poet that is known as a realistic poet. It was his intent to demonstrate to those at home exactly what the conditions were like. So we had several different types of poems or poets indeed in World War One. There were those at the beginning who were all about helping men to get recruited, so the recruitment poets, such as Jessie Pope, who were celebrating the glory of war. And then you often had, around the time as well that Owen was writing, another chap called Siegfried Sassoon, and he wrote very sarcastic war poetry, criticising the authorities for sending men to their death. Now, this war, of course, has been criticised so much because it had such a huge loss of life for so little gain. And, you know, poems that we see coming from this time, and Owen's are very much examples of this, are really angry. You know, the soldiers were in these muddy, dangerous trenches, whereas the generals who put them there were living in a greater deal of comfort. So we do see that there is a real disparity there between the powerful and the powerless when we're thinking about putting people into conflict. So remember, often those who were making the men take the most risks weren't going over the top themselves. That's not, of course, universal, but it's quite frequently seen. Within the poem, as I very briefly touched on, Owen is identifying that it's not just the Germans who are the enemies, but it's the weather that just adds to this enduring misery that the men experience. And when we think about it, the poem seems to be a little bit more about this weather and the conditions in the trenches, because the conditions were often so awful in war. You need to think about the monotony of trench life. People would be sitting in these horrible, freezing cold, water and rat-filled holes in the ground for weeks on end, just waiting to go over the top. So there was a great deal of just sitting around. It must have done something to the minds of these men. So the conflict is between man and nature. It's also, of course, the conflicts of war. We've got to think about the relevance of this. Man's created machines that can launch these explosive shells for miles and destroy the natural world. Yet nature can still do more harm than any of these things. She is the ultimate triumphant figure. You need to think about how the reverse could also be seen as true. Man does have the power to make the natural world seem artificial, but he doesn't have command over it. So in this poem, we'll see things like how the brambles on the battlefield is actually referring to barbed wire. Man has destroyed nature in that respect, but nature is now going about destroying him. You can certainly get a sense that the tone of this poem is one of despair, and it's a sense that war is totally dehumanizing. It strips you of hope. It strips you of the person that you were. And I'm sure that you all understand that so many of these men came back from war very differently to how they left for it. They were shells of themselves because of the atrocities and the experiences that they had witnessed. There's so much to say about this poem because it's so long. I'm going to go through it as rapidly as I can. Once again, just a snapshot, very quick, of language and structure. There's so much you can get out of this though, so don't just use this as your basis. One of the huge things that comes through is, again, phonological or sound devices. And you can see in this poem that Owen is using masses of onomatopoeia and alliteration. So we've got this beautiful specialist type of alliteration here. It's called a fricative. You don't need to use that one. Alliteration will do just fine, but for sets 1 or 2, I know that you do love a good word. So flowing flakes that flock. So this alliterative or fricative sound really adds to the stillness, the boredom, and the sense of expectation that emerges. We've also got that sibilant S sound as well, and it really changes the tone in the poem. We see that sudden, successive, and streak, the silence. We've got that almost whistling S sound, like bullets that are cutting through the air. We can hear the whistle through the wind. We've got very much this sense of militaristic language again, just like we had in the previous texts that we've looked at. So when we looked at Charge of the Light Brigade, we saw that that was there. Yet we actually see that the military language in this poem is used to personify the weather. The weather is positioned as an additional army. So we think about this idea of dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army. And that's really a sense of despair and a complete lack of hope. Dawn is supposed to bring with it new starts, new hopes, freshness, but all it does is bring more misery to the men. So when we can see it, it's a ruthless enemy. So it's a very, very clever use of how military words are applied. There's a sense that there's contrasting language, and it really describes the movement of the weather. We've got merciless, silent, and mad. There was a poet, as you know, called Tennyson, who wrote Charge of the Light Brigade. And in one of his other poems, he claimed that nature was very vengeful, and he referred to her as red in tooth and claw. And we can very much see that from those fabulous adjectives that we see being used to describe her there. We've also got this contrast with the movement of the soldiers. So we've got the insanity of the weather, and then we've got this sense that these men are beaten. The words that are used here are wearied, worried, watching, that wah, wah, wah sound. It's almost woeful in itself. The next thing I'd like to talk about, which is so obvious really, is this sense of pathetic fallacy. You've got this real sense of how it sets the mood here. The whole idea of the east wind, you know, having no mercy and being so cold, and that it knives them. Think about the brutality of that. And that brings us to developing those ideas of personification a little bit more. This weather is armed. If you're knifing someone, it's almost as if the wind feels as sharp as a bayonet on the end of one of the soldiers' guns. So we can see that it's a real threat. We've also got the strength of the elements coming through in other ways, because we see the mad gusts tugging on the wires there. And so it's almost as if the wind is just like an insane person doing what it will, just for no other reason than because it can. We've also got ideas of abandonment that come through this repetition of closed. So there's the ideas of barriers between the soldiers and their former lives. That's really quite sad as we go into that almost dream sequence of the poem, where they're going into their imaginations and remembering the warmth of home. Note how their imaginations drift to thoughts of warmth and spring, times when they were a world apart from this atrocious place. There's one thing more in language that I would like to just point out, and it's right at the end here. And it's this idea, all their eyes are ice. So it's referring to the burying party, or indeed, could it be the people that they are collecting? So this is a metaphorical and a literal line that we've got. When we think about how all of the eyes are ice, it could be simply that it's cold. There is an unblinkingness to the eyes. But metaphorically speaking, it could just be that their eyes have become hardened and cold to the atrocious sights that they're seeing. Or if we're thinking about these being the eyes of the dead, they're now unseeing eyes. They are ice, they're frozen in that moment, they're frozen in time. Very disturbing things. All right, so on to structure very quickly. And the poem uses lots of pauses. We've got loads of ellipsis and caesura. And we've also got that repetition of nothing happens. And what this is Owen really experimenting with time. We're seeing that he's stretching it out. He's dragging it to show the monotony and boredom that the soldiers were experiencing as they were waiting for something, anything to happen. We have got 8 stanzas in the poem, and the use of the half line that ends them. We've got that sort of little ending there that really sort of rounds off. And what this does is, as we see it going through the stanzas, it reinforces a sense of what we call stasis. Simple terms, stillness. It makes it sound very still. And what it does is it just takes us back to this idea that we are almost experiencing Groundhog Day. Nothing is happening at all. We've got some half rhyme in the poem as well, and this is where words appear to rhyme, but they sound a little bit wrong when they're read out. And because of that, what it does is it creates this sense of unease, and that sort of mirrors this uneasiness that soldiers must have been experiencing when they were in the trenches. And we do end the poem very sadly. Remember, beginnings and endings are really good to talk about for structure in both your language and your literature exams. So here we can think about how the poem comes to a close. And there is a fear of the night. There is this fear of more loss of life, and how none of these people have the power to change anything that's about to come. Right, so although it sounds a little bit bleak, it is an absolute beauty of a poem. Please do take those few minutes just to think about what I've said, to really think about which poems you can compare this to, because trust me, I can just go through pretty much all of the poems in the anthology and make exposure fit. Owen has done a beautiful job, and I'm sure that you guys will do an equally wonderful piece of work in your exam if you're lucky enough to have this poem to deal with. You take care, and I will see you next week. Much love to you all. Bye.